I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello Horror Hounds, welcome to my horror house. I wanted to mark an anniversary, a birthday of sorts. It's a year since Local Haunts, a Horrortube Anthology, was published, conceived, edited, put together by the brilliant Regina from Regina's Haunted Library. It's an anthology of horror stories written by fellow YouTubers. Profits are still going to First Book, a literacy charity. It's a project that I'm still desperately proud to have been a part of. So as a sort of birthday celebration, I just wanted to read you guys my story from the anthology. If you want to get a hold of a copy, I'll put links down below. Just go to Amazon, Local Haunts. But here is my little contribution to the whole. It's a story I call Crowthorne. Crowthorne had been on my mind for some time, so I wasn't surprised to find I'd been drifting closer towards the village I'd known as a girl. The notion that I could go back began as an idle daydream, but once the thought took root, it became inevitable that I would return to those childhood haunts of mine. I don't think I've ever properly spoken about the place to anyone from outside. I always suspected that talking about growing up in a village would invite all kinds of assumptions. I mean, yes, there is a carnival every couple of years. A young girl is chosen to be the carnival princess. There's a procession of floats and people in costumes which moves through the village, down the high street, towards a fete on the recreation ground. But it's hardly Midsummer or the Wicker Man. The truth is that growing up in a village like that is mainly just the same rounds of home then school, friends then family, that most everyone knows from their early years. There were trips into town for the cinema or a McDonald's. There was the same worry about being liked and the same hatred of homework that all kids have. We did have the surrounding woodland, which I suppose not everyone gets when they're young. I've spent so much time since then in bricked-up places that I think the built-up world became normal to me. So perhaps it was the sight of plentiful trees which made me realise I'd been drifting back. Maybe the trees had set my mind to returning. Some of us kids had woods on our doorstep. We could leave the house, cross the street and run into the green. We'd hear tell of older boys and girls taking their bikes out after dark and cycling the Devil's Highway. And of course we found evidence of their fires and underage drinking when we played there in the daytime. But we were children and our concerns were childish. The high street didn't hold much appeal, save the sweet shops and the video store. But out amongst the trees we built dens, we hollered, chased, screamed. It was August and the chill of autumn hadn't quite started to bite, but even so the high street was leaden and grey. I looked down that stretch of road with an uneasy feeling brought on by the strange marriage of the unfamiliar new and recognisable old. I hadn't been in Crowthorne for a little over 34 years, and as I made my way down the street again, feeling obtrusively out of place, I was surprised by how many of the shops from my time had survived. They stood like implacable artefacts, and I marvelled that some of these small niche businesses were still around. They also made me feel increasingly self-conscious. What was I doing here? Everything had moved on. I had moved on. Yet here were these shop fronts dotted up and down, stubborn remainders from decades ago that felt as if they'd been waiting all this time for me to come home. I caught my reflection in a shop window and was surprised when I didn't see the pale image of a little girl staring back. Instead, I looked like a ghost out of time, almost as if my spirit were trapped on the other side of the pane while the other shoppers passed me by without a glance. What would I do if someone called out my name, if someone recognised me? I think I quickened my pace. I wanted to get off the high street. I hadn't come back for this anyway. This wasn't Crowthorne, not my Crowthorne. Now that I was here, I wanted to see Amy's house. Amy Dooley was my best friend. When I think of Crowthorne, I think of her. I wasn't returning to the village, I was coming back to Amy. People called us the sisters, and eventually, secretly, we agreed that we were sisters. She was shorter than me, slighter, but she had more presence in a group than I could ever muster. Funny though, in my mind's eye, she's always taller than me. I was simply happy to follow her lead. Wherever she wanted to go and whatever she wanted to do was always fine with me. Climbing halfway up the hill to her house brought back memories of coming home from school. I was getting a little out of breath, but remembered how we used to fly up this road in our buckled shoes, knee-high white socks, and acrylic navy skirts after the final bell. I thought about Mrs. Dooley with a tray of jam sandwiches and orange juice for the two of us, her girls, she sometimes called us, insisting that we eat something before we both inevitably scrambled outside again. It wasn't the same when I got to her house. I'm really not sure what I'd expected. Strangers lived there now, so I wasn't going to knock on the front door, and I could hardly lurk around on the pavement outside. Instead, I walked past on the opposite side of the road and snatched surreptitious glances up at her bedroom window. The curtains were different. An extension had been added to the side of the house. There was a new front door. It made me feel sad and angry. Then I thought of Mrs. Dooley crying, that strange, strangled noise she'd made. I don't want to talk about that. I might have run then, I'm not sure, along the path between houses and into the moist cold of Napier Woods. Muddy tracks were hardening after the first frosts of the year, but even so I left the well-trodden pathways and stole into a crunching carpet of dead curled leaves. The air was thicker here, damp. I felt it was insulating me from the outside world. I inhaled deeply, and the sounds of my breath and the fall of my feet joined to the quiet cacophony all around me. A shiver of bushes to my left as something fled from my approach. The chirping whistles of starlings and thrushes overhead. The background static shush of the canopy of leaves set in motion by a breeze which didn't quite reach down to me. How many times had Amy and I run down this path and through these woods? How many of our games had I forgotten? Not the raucous, shrieking hide-and-seek in gangs, or that one game of kiss-chase suggested by a boy who lived in Amy's street, but the games we'd made up together in our own little world, the pacts we'd made as secret sisters, the things we'd promised never to tell anybody. How much of that was lost to me now? My heart was racing, so I looked up into the branches and leaves and slowed my breathing, just like my doctor had showed me. The treetops shimmered, smaller limbs waved with a languor I didn't share, but I thought of the interconnected roots beneath my feet, and with a wave of calm realised that the green understood time differently to us. Unlike the high street, it wasn't strange that Napier Woods still felt familiar. Unlike the high street, this place felt welcoming. I wasn't out of place or out of time here, and for these trees my decades away were just a yesterday. It was all still here, waiting. I remembered the time Amy found a circle of mushrooms, a fairy ring. I counted my breaths in and calmly let them out as my lips spread into a smile at the image of her spinning in that circle. She twirled and said hello to the invisible fairy folk watching from the shrubs and bushes. I joined in then, and at her instruction we curtsied to the king who lived beneath the large tree near that fairy ring. We returned to that tree so often it became our tree, the tree, as we soon called it. I caught a flash of yellow up ahead on the path and ducked behind the nearest trunk. A dog walker's raincoat. They hadn't seen me though, and they were moving away. The black dog marked me, however. It paused, extended its neck and swiveled its ears towards me, but after a moment's consideration it turned and followed its owner. I waited for a while, minding my breathing, before moving deeper into the woods. I wanted to find the tree. Now that I was back within this dappled, dewy light, I could recall it perfectly, the thick roots like a hand splayed on the ground, its fingers digging into the earth, gnarled bark with an old man's beard of moss and creeping ivy, that first, lowest branch curving down towards the ground, beckoning, as if waiting to scoop you up, inviting you to climb. With it so fixed in my mind, I was sure that I could find the tree again without any bother, but each time I was sure it was near, just around the next turn or over the next small rise, my memories proved false. My steps became clompy and impatient, sturdy boots snapping twigs and kicking up plumes of leaf litter. More than once I turned around and doubled back. Hadn't there been a song? Something to the Fairy King? something Amy had made up to allow us to approach the tree. Everywhere looked familiar, but the tree was nowhere. I got the notion that the birdsong was laughter directed at me. I had the mad thought that the tree was toying with me. I mean, it had been magic after all, hadn't it? What I mean is, Amy and I thought it was magic. We pretended it was magic. This wasn't right. It should have been here. I set my steps up the incline towards Broadmoor Hospital, even though I knew Amy and I had never played very close to the high red brick walls of that place. As children, we'd only had vague notions of it being a bad place. What I now understood as a high-security psychiatric hospital filled our imagination back then with notions of the criminally insane, those two words meaning as much to us as the idea of a boogeyman. We never went near, but we all lived with the sirens. 13 of them built to alert the people of Crowthorne and the surrounding area if ever one of the patients escaped. They were tested every Monday morning at 10 a.m., a 2-minute escape siren which slowly wound down to be replaced by the 2-minute all-clear tone. It was just part of life in Crowthorne. To outsiders, I understand it sounds quite bizarre, but you can find videos on YouTube of the things being tested if you don't believe me. There was a story, I don't know if it's true, of the sirens being tested one time when they forgot to sound the all clear. We heard that a little old lady had locked herself indoors for 3 days because she thought someone had escaped. I don't know. We thought it was funny at the time. Another time, an older girl told Amy and I about the Yorkshire Ripper who was locked up in there. That was enough for us to keep our distance, trust me. I think maybe I had some nightmares around that time. My bedroom looked out over our back garden, and even though I didn't really know who the Yorkshire Ripper was back then, there were a few nights, I think, when I dreamt he was in our garden looking up at my bedroom window. How had that song of Amy's gone? Something to the Fairy King, asking permission to approach the tree. One of the sing-songy tunes she was always humming distractedly to herself. Right then a very strong image came unbidden of her red Wellington boots skipping away from me through the undergrowth, me trailing, always happy to follow where she led. Those boots skipping towards the tree, singing her song, skipping uphill. It hit me so suddenly that I thought for a moment I was actually following her again. And then there was the tree right in front of me. It looked exactly as I'd remembered it. I stopped in my tracks, and for the life of me I thought I'd hear Amy's crunching footsteps tripping away and the melody of her tune drifting up into the branches. For a moment it felt strange not to see her sitting on that low branch, swinging her legs and yammering away. This was closer to Broadmoor than I ever remember us coming, but here the tree stood. I drew nearer with my arm out, gingerly, the same way someone might approach a horse. I lay my palm against the cold, scratchy bark and began searching with my eyes all around the base, thinking that surely, after all this time, but remarkably, it was still there. I could just make out the top of the frame amongst the usual woodland detritus, behind the ivy, the fairy door we'd nailed to the trunk between 2 fat knuckles of roots. I dropped to my knees and pulled the ivy away, scooping handfuls of dead leaves and twigs from between the roots. It was weathered and time-worn, set crooked against the bark and held with bent nails where our small hands had tried to hammer it in place. The door had been Amy's idea, but I knew where my dad kept his tools, so I'd brought the hammer and nails to fix it in place. This was the Fairy King's home. Amy would always address him formally, and I know that she sometimes wrote things on notes, wishes and secrets, and slipped them behind the miniature doorway. Other times we'd leave bits of food, a corner of a chocolate bar, or some crisp crumbs from the bottom of a packet. One time we left a piece of Amy's birthday cake. Now those tiny hinges were stiff with rust, the wood warped, but adult hands can be forceful and insistent. I wriggled my fingertips into the gap and pulled. I thought I might snap the tiny door off, but with a couple of short tugs it creaked away from the tree. I lowered my head closer to the ground, but inside the hollow now there was only the dirty candy floss of a long abandoned spider's web. I stared inside for a few moments and a woodlouse scuttled out and into the nearby shelter of some dead leaves. Above the door was more chainmail ivy, which I ripped away, noting how the pattern of vines remained in the moss underneath like arteries and veins. We'd carved our spells there, in the trunk. My name, hers, some spiral shapes and stars. There had been a penknife in my dad's toolbox, which we'd used. They'd been so bright when we'd carved them, but now they were dark and green, almost discernible. I traced our names with a fingertip as if they were braille, and then followed one of the spirals to its centre. This was Crowthorne. This was where we had run and laughed and made our silly pledges to the Fairy King. But this was not the secret place. No, this was not the greenhouse. This was where we first played with Mr. Twigs, but soon after that, we would all go to the greenhouse, and eventually I learned that Amy used to go to the greenhouse alone to play with Mr. Twigs. Later that summer, Amy Dooley disappeared. Mrs. Dooley had cried and made that strange noise in her throat which sounded like the Broadmoor sirens. After that, it was nothing but questions for a long time. People came to my house and sat with my parents and me. Other times my dad would take me to visit the police station to talk about Amy. I wasn't in trouble. They kept telling me that I wasn't in trouble, but I was scared nonetheless. Sometimes in the evening, my mum or my dad would come to my room and talk to me gently. They would ask the same questions as the police. One evening, after I'd gone to bed, Mrs. Dooley came to the house. I heard her downstairs asking to speak with me, getting louder. I didn't want my parents to let her up to my room. I just want to know where my baby is, she kept saying. She must have said something. She must be able to tell me something. I just want to know. But Amy hadn't come to call for me that day, the day she went missing. I told lots of different people again and again, and my mum repeated it now, down in our hallway, with Mrs. Dooley crying at the front door. Amy didn't come here. I was here all afternoon myself. I would have known. She told me she was going out to play. She told me that, and we both know that meant she was coming here. They were inseparable. She didn't. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but she didn't come here. I told about Mr. Twigs. I had to, even though it was one of our secrets. I told the police about Mr. Twigs and how we played with him in the woods and then in the greenhouse, and then I told them how Amy started playing with Mr. Twigs on her own. Their questions went round and round, and sometimes I would be taken out to the woods to show them where we played. I showed them the tree. I showed them our tree and felt a stab of betrayal watching these grown-ups set up a ring of tape around it and go rooting through the leaves and sticks and dirt on their knees with their fingertips. They took pictures. They took pictures of the fairy door and of our carvings, our spells. Then they asked me again and again about Mr. Twigs and the greenhouse. I told them what I could. I told them that I didn't know how to get to the greenhouse, even though they asked over and over about it. They asked me to describe it. Was it a long way from the tree? Did you walk there? Did he take you in a car? Was there anything about the place that stuck in your mind? What colour was the door? Were there any tall buildings nearby? Any road signs you noticed? Did it have a distinctive smell? They asked me to describe Mr. Twigs. They asked me about the games we'd played there. One of them even brought me some paper and colouring pencils and asked me to draw him. I made them a picture of Amy and me and Mr. Twigs together in the greenhouse, but I've never been very good at drawing. They seemed disappointed with everything I told them, and eventually I got used to the forced smiles and being told I was doing very well, while understanding that I wasn't telling them what they wanted to hear. I even sang them Amy's song. In the wood, a little man stood, playing in the greenhouse, yeah, yeah, yeah. We'd sing that over and over, getting louder each time, spinning around until we were dizzy and would fall to the ground laughing. Then we'd get up and do it again, jabbing at the words, heads a-whirl, twirling till we must have looked frenzied, trying to walk in straight lines and stumbling, falling, shuffling on all fours like tots, trying to catch our breath while the rhyme still span in our heads. In the wood, a little man stood, playing in the greenhouse, yeah, yeah, yeah. Thinking back to that, my head began to spin again. It was a good job I was already down on my knees and leaning against the trunk, because the blood suddenly left my head and dark flowers bloomed in my vision. Ink blots. I thought I was having a heart attack. It was probably a panic attack. Everything around me went fuzzy and a high-pitched whine filled my ears. The blotchy sunlight through the leaves became abstract patterns of pulsing black, white and green. The tone in my ears was the screaming of the tree, and I slowly comprehended that when a tree screams, it lasts for years. A howl that is communicated underground through its roots to the surrounding vegetation, the plants, moss and fungi. I realized that if I died there and was allowed to decompose into the compost beneath me, I would become part of that scream. My vision returned slowly. The whine in my ears subsided. My heart was pounding and I was slick with a cold sweat. I think I'd probably lost consciousness for a few seconds. I rolled gracelessly onto my front and pushed myself up onto wobbly legs. A robin sat on the lowest branch of the tree, its bead black eye regarding me from a tilted head. My mind was a tumble of words like the association exercises I used to do with my doctor. Robin, bobbin, robbing, gobbling, goblin. The string of words was in Amy's voice, though. It was time to move on from there. My childish drawing of Mr. Twigs is probably still in an old police file somewhere, I shouldn't wonder, along with cassette tapes of my interviews, my wavering, high-pitched voice cracking and afraid, trying to explain as best I could. Secret sisters. I can hear us saying that in unison even now. We said it a lot, linking our little fingers in a promise. I can also still hear me breaking a promise, telling a secret, with a small voice in a small room with a policewoman. One afternoon, Amy found me in the woods playing with Mr. Twigs, I'd said. After that, their questions wriggled like fingers at a stubborn lock. They pried me open and winkled more and more out of me. It was the school holidays. One afternoon, Amy found me by the tree playing with Mr. Twigs. Soon, we both went to the woods to play with him, and then later on, we used to go to the greenhouse together. I found out that Amy had started playing with Mr. Twigs alone in the greenhouse. I promised not to tell. They wanted to know everything I could tell about him. Mr. Twigs lived in the woods, I said. He would only come out if Amy and I were around. He had long fingers like twigs and a smelly coat of moss and feathers. We went to the greenhouse together. It was a special place that only we knew about, our secret place where the walls were green. It was damp and cold, and there were no lights, so you needed torches. There was an old cot bed with rusty springs, and we could make as much noise as we liked because no one could hear us when we were there. We moved away that winter, but my parents didn't stop talking to me and taking me to talk to people. In my head, it seems like an endless procession of men and women who wanted to talk to me about how I was feeling, what I was thinking, what I was dreaming about. But I knew they all really just wanted to talk about Mr. Twigs. Oh, they'd act friendly and we'd talk about anything or nothing or whatever was on my mind, but eventually they'd all come sidling up to the question they really wanted to ask. Some would wait for weeks and weeks, but always, eventually, in some roundabout way, they would bend their questions towards him. Eventually, I stopped talking about him, and soon after that, after we'd moved a couple more times, I stopped talking about Crowthorne altogether. If people never knew, I reasoned, they could never ask. But I would think of him. I never really made any new friends in any of the schools I moved to. I missed Amy, of course, in a way words can't describe. But after a while, when I wanted to conjure a friend, more often than not, it was Mr. Twigs I thought of and not her. At first I used to talk to him out loud, and looking back, that's probably why Mum and Dad had me talking to so many people even after we'd moved away. So we learned to keep our games secret. Most of the time he'd hide from the adults and make me giggle. He'd be amongst the bushes in our back garden when I was out playing, or looking out through the slit in a postbox when we walked past. Other times he'd be angry at me for leaving him in Crowthorne. I cried for a little while by the tree and then tried to clean myself up as best I could. I made my way back out of the woods and returned on shaky legs to the high street. I was suddenly very hungry and remembered a nice-looking coffee shop I'd spotted, which hadn't been there in my day. So I sat at a table away from the window, had some coffee and cake, and watched the late afternoon darken outside. After that, I walked the streets some more, keeping my head down, not retracing the steps of my childhood, but just measuring out time until nightfall. I had to wait for dark before I went back to the green house. That was the one secret I'd kept, the one promise to Amy that I never broke. No matter what, she'd said, our little fingers locked, this is our secret place. No one can ever know about it. No matter what, I echoed, I'll never tell. It was getting cold. I could have killed some time in a pub, but I was worried I'd stick out as an unfamiliar face, or even worse, be recognised. So instead I walked in varying loops around the quieter streets, always circling back towards the greenhouse like water around a drain. I never told anyone where it was, and after Amy disappeared I never went back there in case I was being watched. That's why I felt sick standing in the dark, closer to the greenhouse than I'd been for the best part of my life. That's why part of me wanted to leave all over again, because after Amy left me, I had left him, left Crowthorne, and I didn't know if he'd still be there waiting for me, and I didn't know if he'd be angry. He's Mr. Twigs and he dances jigs in an overcoat like a smelly goat, and his fingers snap like a cracker jack while he spins you round in the underground. I was singing another one of our songs under my breath, just putting off the inevitable. It was dark enough now and quiet enough. No more waiting, no more delays. The greenhouse was so close to a busy road that I'd spent every day of that summer waiting for them to find it. Every time the police took me out into the woods, I felt sure they were going to take me there and make me break my final promise. I crept a little way up the Devil's Highway, past the hum of an electrical substation, and slipped into the wooded area there. This was how Amy and I had always approached the greenhouse. The trees deadened the Doppler hiss of the occasional passing car and mostly blocked their headlights. Still, I moved in darkness, not wanting to risk the torch on my phone being seen. Progress through the undergrowth was clumsy, and each noise I made seemed amplified in the relative quiet of the night. Something fussed and flapped in a nearby tree, and every footstep seemed to crunch or snap something. As a child, the greenhouse had been wonderful, a secret hideaway. As an adult, I understood it was a Royal Observatory Corps monitoring post, one of over 1,000 all over the country, mostly abandoned now, built during the Cold War to report in the event of a nuclear burst. The way in had been overgrown when we were kids, and the past 3 decades had only worked to hide it further. Even in the low light, though, even covered in nettles and vegetation, I recognised the squat, metre-high concrete entrance to the underground room. It took time, and I worked methodically and patiently so as to reduce any noise, but eventually I cleared enough undergrowth to get to the rusted metal hatch. It took more time and effort to finally lever the hatch open. Stale air plumed over me from out of the shaft like a puff of mushroom spores, and I stared into the square black hole. My eyes had grown accustomed to the gloom, and I could make out the top of the iron ladder on one side of the shaft, which led 4 or 5 metres down into what Amy and I had called the green house. I tested the top rung with a boot before committing my full body weight to the ladder, tentative at first, but then with more force. A dull creak echoed around the chamber beneath me, and with one last look around, I swung myself over the edge and began to descend. Once I was in the shaft, my breathing and clambering sounded loud, reflecting off the close walls. I could smell the rust on the ice-cold rungs. After a few metres, I expected to feel the concrete floor beneath me each time I dropped my foot, But there was always one more rung. The thought of descending forever flitted through my mind, so when my foot met the bottom it came as a mild surprise. I looked back up the stain-streaked, flaky painted shaft, and the opening above looked smaller than I'd anticipated. Just a square of darkish blue, with perhaps a wisp of cloud, a creaking climb-away. I could feel the space behind me. It smelt earthy. He was here. He'd been waiting all this time. I turned slowly. Little pins of light flashed in my eyes, my vision trying to compensate in the pitch black, and I could hear a shallow breathing from the shadows, or was it just the sound of my breath coming back at me? Mr. Twigs? I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, squinting against the screen's glow as I turned on the torch. Sudden light caused shadows to rear and slide around the rectangular room as I swung my arm back and forth. Swirling particles filled the air, caught in the beam like footage of a shipwreck at the bottom of the ocean. Part of the far ceiling had collapsed inwards, and roots and mould had got in and spread like a sickness. I could see the corroded springs of the cot at the far end behind the dirty waist-high cabinet which still stood against the left-hand wall. And there, perched on top of the cabinet, Mr. Twigs was watching me through the gloom. I could feel the pulse in my neck. My shaking hand made his shadow wobble, and he looked as if he were moving. "I'm sorry I left you," I said in a voice which sounded louder in that confined place than I'd intended. He sat, impassive, and for long beats of time I didn't really believe that I'd come back and didn't believe that he was really there. My little stick man. My little poppet made of twigs and leaves, old doll's clothes and feathers, bound by string. Bound in parts by lengths of my own hair. My idea. Mine. One afternoon, Amy found me in the woods playing with Mr. Twigs, and after that she wanted to play with him too. She decided that Mr. Twigs would live in the woods, and I'd agreed, happy to play along, happy to follow her lead. So we hid him in the bushes near the tree, and we'd go and play with him together. I crossed the room and picked him up. His coat was mouldy now, the stuffing gone, so that I could feel the 2 bundles of twigs tied into a cross which made up his thin body and outstretched arms. He still had his neckerchief on, a piece of patterned cloth I'd taken from an old dress I'd outgrown. Once Amy found the greenhouse, we started playing there instead, and she determined that Mr. Twigs should move. So we moved him, and for a while we played with him here, together. I looked across at the mouldering cot. Amy was where I had left her. It's funny, in my mind she's always that little bit bigger than me, but she was really very small on those corroded bent springs. She'd become shrunken and grey. Her skin looked like old paper, pulled in at the cheeks and eyes, and her fingers looked like they'd snap, just like Mr. Twigs did. "You shouldn't have played with him without me," I said. Amy hadn't called for me that afternoon. She'd gone to the greenhouse without me. It had been easy enough to slip out of the house without my mum noticing. I could still see the handle of my dad's screwdriver poking out just under her armpit. He was my friend first.